Biggest disappointment. That's what my father called me the day I told him I was enlisting. Not surprised. Not concerned. Disappointed. He said it with the same tone he'd use to describe a botched construction job or a losing football team. My mother stood silent in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. My brother Trevor smirked from the couch, barely looking up from his phone. Nobody asked why. Nobody asked what I hoped to accomplish or what I wanted to prove. They just wrote me off as another bad decision in a life they'd already decided wasn't worth celebrating. 5 years later, I stood on a platform at Naval Base Coronado with 300 Navy SEALs behind me in formation. The commander held my new rank insignia in his hands. Cameras from 3 major networks pointed at the ceremony. And my phone had been buzzing nonstop for 2 days straight with calls from a father who suddenly wanted to talk, a mother who couldn't stop crying, and a brother who was scrambling to explain to his law firm colleagues why he never mentioned his sister was being honored by the Secretary of the Navy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever been dismissed by the people who were supposed to believe in you most, if you've ever been told you weren't good enough or that your dreams were foolish, stay with me. Because this isn't just a story about proving people wrong. It's about discovering that the loudest voices in your life are sometimes the ones that know you the least. And sometimes, the only approval you need is the one you give yourself. Let me take you back to where this all started. Ridgewood, Pennsylvania was the kind of town where everyone knew your family name before they knew your first name. 45 minutes outside Pittsburgh, it was a place built on steel mills that had closed decades ago and high school football games that still mattered more than anything else happening in the world. The Brennan name carried weight there, not because of money or prestige, but because of history. My grandfather Eugene had started Brennan and Sons Construction in 1953, right after he came back from Korea. My father Frank took it over in the 80s, and the plan had always been for Trevor to make it a third generation when the time came. I was never part of that plan. Not because I was the oldest, but because I was born the wrong gender for a company called Brennan and Sons. My father made that clear in 1,000 small ways throughout my childhood. When Trevor got his first toy tool set at age 5, I got a dollhouse. When Trevor started going to job sites on Saturdays at age 12, I was told to stay home and help my mother with household projects. When Trevor announced he wanted to study business in college, my father beamed with pride and started talking about transition plans. When I said I wanted to study criminal justice, he asked me if I planned to become a school crossing guard. Frank Brennan was a man shaped entirely by one moment in his life. In 1985, he'd been the quarterback who led Ridgewood High to the state championship. That victory had defined him so completely that he never quite figured out who he was supposed to be after the cheering stopped. He'd married my mother Diane right out of high school, taken over his father's business because it was expected, and spent the next 30 years reliving that one perfect season. Our living room was a shrine to it. Trophies on the mantel. Framed newspaper clippings on the walls. A signed football in a glass case that nobody was allowed to touch. He coached youth football every fall, attended every Ridgewood home game, and could still tell you the play-by-play of that championship game down to the yard line. My mother Diane had built her identity around being Frank Brennan's wife. She sold real estate in Ridgewood and the surrounding townships, and her entire pitch to clients revolved around being a local, being connected, knowing everyone worth knowing. She cared deeply about appearances, about what people thought, about maintaining the image of a successful family. She drove a leased Lexus she couldn't quite afford, wore designer bags she bought at outlet malls, and made sure our Christmas card photo was professionally shot every single year. Authenticity mattered less to her than presentation. Substance mattered less than style. Trevor was everything they wanted. Tall, athletic, charming in that effortless way that made teachers love him and peers follow him. He'd played varsity football all 4 years of high school, not because he was particularly talented but because he had the Brennan name and the coaches remembered our father. He went to University of Pittsburgh, joined a fraternity, graduated with a business degree, and got accepted to Duquesne Law School. By the time he passed the bar at 26, he was already being fast-tracked at a corporate firm in downtown Pittsburgh. He bought a condo in a trendy neighborhood, drove a BMW, and started dating Vanessa, a marketing executive whose family owned a chain of car dealerships. My parents talked about him constantly. Every dinner conversation somehow circled back to Trevor's latest accomplishment or upcoming milestone. I was the afterthought. The one they introduced with a slight hesitation, as if they weren't entirely sure what to say about me. "Kayla's figuring things out," my mother would tell people, which was code for "Kayla hasn't done anything worth mentioning." I'd been a solid student, not valedictorian but consistently on honor roll. I'd run cross-country, not because I loved it but because it was something that didn't require teammates or popularity. I'd worked part-time at the public library all through high school, shelving books and helping patrons find materials, and I'd loved the quiet structure of it. I got into Penn State, which should have been celebrated, but the conversation at dinner that night had focused mostly on how much it would cost and whether it was really necessary. I chose criminal justice because I wanted to understand systems. I wanted to know how laws were enforced, how investigations worked, how justice was supposed to function even when it didn't. My father had asked me once what I planned to do with that degree, and when I said I wasn't sure yet, he'd laughed and said I should have just saved the tuition money. My mother suggested I minor in communications so I'd have something practical to fall back on. Trevor told me I should go to law school if I wanted anyone to take me seriously. None of them asked what interested me about it or what I hoped to learn. They only saw it as a failed launch, a degree without an obvious career path, another example of me not thinking things through. The military wasn't something I'd grown up dreaming about. My grandfather Eugene had served in Korea, but he'd become estranged from the family years before I was born over some dispute with my father that nobody talked about. I knew he lived alone in a small apartment near the Rusty Anchor, a bar where veterans gathered, but I'd only met him a handful of times at funerals or weddings where ignoring him would have been too obvious. My father spoke about him with thinly veiled resentment, calling him stubborn and bitter. My mother avoided mentioning him altogether. The message was clear. Eugene Brennan had made choices that removed him from the family narrative, and we were all better off for it. But during my junior year at Penn State, I took an elective course on military history and strategy. The professor was a retired Army colonel who taught with the kind of clarity and purpose I hadn't encountered before. He didn't just lecture about battles and dates. He talked about leadership under pressure, about the ethics of decision-making in impossible situations, about what it meant to be responsible for lives other than your own. Something about it gripped me. I started reading everything I could find about military structure, special operations, intelligence work. I watched documentaries about Navy SEALs and Marine reconnaissance units. I learned about the women who were breaking barriers in combat roles and support positions that had been closed to them for generations. By the time I was a senior, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to serve. Not because of some patriotic fervor or family legacy, but because I wanted to be part of something that demanded excellence, that held people accountable, that measured you by what you could do rather than who your family was. I wanted to prove to myself that I was capable of more than Ridgewood, Pennsylvania thought I was. So I went to a Navy recruiting office in State College, took the ASVAB, scored high enough to qualify for intelligence programs, and started the process of enlisting. I waited until winter break of my senior year to tell my family. I thought maybe if I presented it as a done decision, something already in motion, they'd accept it more easily. I was wrong. We were sitting in the living room after dinner. Trevor was home from law school for the holidays. My mother was sorting through mail. My father was watching a bowl game with the sound too loud. I stood in the doorway and said I needed to tell them something. I'm enlisting in the Navy. I've already signed my contract. I ship out to basic training in May. The room went still. My father muted the television. My mother looked up from the mail, her expression frozen somewhere between confusion and alarm. Trevor actually laughed, assuming it was a joke. When nobody else joined in, his smile faded. "You're what?" my father said slowly. "I'm joining the Navy. I've qualified for an intelligence specialty. It's a 6-year commitment." Frank Brennan stood up, and I could see the anger building in his jaw. "You signed a military contract without talking to us first. I'm 21. I don't need permission." He shook his head, the disappointment radiating off him like heat. "This is the dumbest thing you've ever done, and that's saying something." My mother finally spoke, her voice thin and strained. "Kayla, why would you do this? You have a degree. You could get a real job." "This is a real job," I said. Trevor leaned forward, arms resting on his knees. "You know women don't actually do the important stuff in the military, right? You'll be filing paperwork on a base somewhere." "That's not true," I said, keeping my voice level. "Women serve in combat support roles. Intelligence specialists deploy with SEAL teams, with special operations units." My father cut me off. "You're going to get yourself killed trying to prove some point that nobody cares about." "I'm not trying to prove anything. This is what I want." He stepped closer, his face hardening. "You're my biggest disappointment, Kayla. I've tried to be patient. I've tried to let you figure things out. But this is you running away because you don't have the guts to build something real." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words landed like a physical blow. My mother didn't defend me. Trevor looked away, uncomfortable but silent. I stood there feeling the weight of every doubt I'd ever had about myself come crashing down, confirmed by the one person whose belief I'd spent my whole life chasing. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I said quietly. "But I'm doing this." Frank turned his back to me and unmuted the television. The conversation was over. My mother went back to her mail, her hands shaking slightly. Trevor pulled out his phone. And I walked out of that room knowing I was completely alone. The months leading up to my departure were cold and silent. My father stopped speaking to me unless absolutely necessary. My mother oscillated between trying to talk me out of it and pretending it wasn't happening. Trevor made occasional jokes about me joining the military to get away from student loans, which weren't even funny enough to hurt. When May arrived and it was time to leave for basic training, I asked if anyone wanted to come to the send-off ceremony at the processing station. My mother said she had an open house she couldn't miss. My father said he had a job that needed finishing. Trevor didn't bother with an excuse. So I took a Greyhound bus to the military entrance processing station in Pittsburgh alone, carrying a single duffel bag with the items I'd been told to bring. I sat in a waiting room with 24 other recruits, most of them 18 or 19, most of them with families crying and taking photos and hugging them like they might never come back. I filled out paperwork by myself. I took my oath by myself. And when they called my name to board the bus to Great Lakes Naval Station, nobody was there to wave goodbye. But here's what my family didn't know, what they couldn't have known because they never asked. I wasn't running away. I was running toward something. Toward the possibility that somewhere in the world, there was a place that would measure me by my effort, my intelligence, my resilience. Toward the chance that I could become someone my father's opinion couldn't touch. And toward a version of myself I'd never get to meet if I stayed in Ridgewood, Pennsylvania, trying to fit into a story that was never written for me. Basic training broke me down in ways I didn't expect. Not physically, though that was brutal, but mentally. Every assumption I had about my own toughness got tested. I learned that I complained too much in my head. That I gave up too early when things got hard. That I'd spent my whole life conserving energy instead of emptying the tank. But I also learned that I could wake up at 4 in the morning and function. That I could run farther than I thought possible. That I could follow orders I didn't understand and trust that there was a reason. And most importantly, I learned that the voice in my head that sounded like my father's disapproval got quieter the farther I pushed myself. After basic, I went to technical training for intelligence analysis at Dam Neck in Virginia Beach. The work was dense and demanding. We studied threat assessment, signal intelligence, pattern analysis, classified briefing protocols. I loved it. For the first time in my life, I was learning skills that felt consequential. I wasn't memorizing information for a test I'd forget a week later. I was training to do work that could save lives. The instructors were tough but fair. They didn't care about my last name or where I came from. They cared whether I could read a surveillance report and identify the critical detail everyone else missed. They cared whether I could stay calm under pressure and communicate clearly when seconds mattered. I kept my head down and my performance high. I made a few friends, other women in the program who understood what it felt like to be constantly proving yourself in spaces that weren't designed for you. One of them was Sierra Hayes, who'd grown up in northern Michigan and joined the Navy to pay for college. We bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared sense of humor about the absurdity of military bureaucracy. She was the first person I told about my family, about the send-off nobody attended, about my father's last words to me. She listened without judgment and then said something I've never forgotten. The people who love you don't make you feel small. If they do, they're not your people. When I graduated from technical training, I got my first duty assignment. Naval Station Norfolk. I'd be working in an intelligence fusion center, supporting fleet operations. It wasn't glamorous. Most of my job involved sitting in a windowless room staring at data streams and writing reports that would get read by people I'd never meet. But I was good at it. I could spot inconsistencies. I could see connections others missed. And within 6 months, I got noticed by Commander Rachel Ortiz, a senior intelligence officer who'd spent 15 years in the field before moving into training and oversight roles. Commander Ortiz was the kind of leader I didn't know existed. She was demanding but never demeaning. She pushed you past what you thought you could do, but she also made sure you knew she believed you could do it. She'd been one of the first women to serve in certain intelligence roles attached to special operations, and she'd faced the kind of resistance and skepticism that would have crushed most people. But she hadn't just survived it. She'd excelled in spite of it. And now she spent her time identifying younger personnel who had potential and making sure they got opportunities to prove it. She called me into her office one afternoon about 8 months into my assignment. "Sit down, Brennan." I sat, unsure if I was in trouble. She slid a file across the desk. "I've been watching your work. You're thorough. You don't jump to conclusions. You ask good questions." I stayed quiet, waiting. "I'm recommending you for a liaison assignment. You'd be attached to a SEAL team as an intelligence analyst. It means deploying. It means being in the field. It means long hours and high stakes. You interested?" I didn't hesitate. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded. "Good. You'll need to pass additional clearances and complete some supplementary training. But I think you're ready. And Brennan, don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong there. You earned this." That assignment changed everything. I spent the next 3 months in specialized training that made basic feel like summer camp. Learning how to operate in hostile environments, how to interpret real-time intelligence during active operations, how to communicate critical information clearly when people were relying on you to keep them alive. The instructors were former special operations personnel who had no patience for hesitation or excuses. They simulated stress in every possible way, pushing us to make decisions when we were exhausted, when information was incomplete, when the stakes felt impossibly high. I failed more in those 3 months than I had in my entire life. I gave wrong assessments. I froze during high-pressure scenarios. I second-guessed myself when I should have trusted my analysis. But every failure came with a debrief, a breakdown of what went wrong and how to correct it. Nobody called me a disappointment. Nobody told me I wasn't cut out for this. They just made me do it again until I got it right. By the time I completed the training and received my deployment orders, I transformed in ways I couldn't have articulated. I walked differently, spoke differently, thought differently. The version of myself that had left Ridgewood felt like a stranger. I was heading to a forward operating base in the Middle East, assigned to a SEAL team conducting counterterrorism operations. My role would be to provide real-time intelligence support, analyze threat patterns, and help the team make informed decisions in the field. I called home before I left, partly out of obligation and partly because some small part of me still hoped things might have changed. My mother answered. Her voice was pleasant but distant, the tone she used with clients she didn't know well. "Hi, Mom. I'm deploying next week. I wanted to let you know." There was a pause. Oh. Where are you going? I can't say specifically. Overseas. It's a 6-month rotation. Another pause. Well, be safe. I'll let your father know. Is he there? He's at a job site. I'll tell him you called. Okay. I just thought someone should know. Of course. Thank you for calling, Kayla. She hung up before I could say anything else. I sat there holding the phone, feeling the familiar ache of trying to connect with people who had already decided I wasn't worth the effort. Trevor didn't answer when I called him. He texted back 3 hours later saying he was in court and would call me later. He never did. The deployment was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Not because of danger, though there was plenty of that, but because of the weight of responsibility. Every piece of intelligence I provided could mean the difference between a successful operation and a catastrophic one. Every assessment I made could determine whether people came home or didn't. The SEAL team I was attached to treated me with professional respect, but I had to earn their trust. They needed to know I wouldn't crack under pressure, that I wouldn't provide information I wasn't certain about, that I could keep my head clear when everything around us was chaos. There were missions that went perfectly, where the intelligence I provided helped the team neutralize threats without a single casualty. There were missions that went sideways, where the situation on the ground didn't match what we expected and everyone had to adapt in real time. And there were long stretches of tedium, sitting in operations centers reviewing surveillance footage and communications intercepts, looking for patterns that might not exist. But somewhere in the middle of that deployment, something shifted inside me. I stopped caring what my family thought. Not in a bitter, resentful way, but in a way that felt like freedom. I realized that their approval had been a weight I'd been carrying my entire life, and out here, thousands of miles away from Ridgewood, it simply didn't matter. The people whose opinions actually mattered were the ones who depended on me to do my job well. The team leaders who trusted my assessments. The commanders who read my reports. The other analysts who collaborated with me on complex threat evaluations. I started writing letters to my grandfather Eugene. I'd found his address through old family documents my mother had left in a box in our basement. I wasn't even sure he'd remember me, but I wrote to him anyway. I told him about my training, about the deployment, about what I was learning. I didn't expect him to write back, but he did. His letters were short, written in shaky handwriting on plain notebook paper. He told me about Korea, about what it had been like to serve when nobody back home understood what you were going through. He told me he was proud of me, which was the first time anyone in my family had ever said that. And he told me that my father had spent his whole life angry at him for choosing the military over the family business, and that some people never forgive you for walking away from the life they planned for you. Those letters became a lifeline. Knowing that somewhere back home, there was one person who understood what I was doing and why it mattered made the isolation easier to bear. When my 6-month deployment ended and I returned to Norfolk, I had orders to take 2 weeks of leave. Most people went home to see family. I flew to Pittsburgh, rented a car, and drove to Ridgewood to visit my grandfather. The rusty anchor was exactly the kind of place you'd expect. Dark wood paneling, worn bar stools, faded photographs of military units on the walls, and a small American flag behind the register. I found Eugene sitting at a corner table with 2 other older men, all of them nursing beers and talking in low voices. He was smaller than I remembered, thinner, his face deeply lined. But when he saw me walk in wearing civilian clothes with my military duffel over my shoulder, his eyes lit up. Kayla. He stood slowly, joints protesting, and pulled me into a hug that smelled like Old Spice and tobacco. You actually came. Of course I came. You wrote to me for 6 months. I wasn't going to ignore that. He introduced me to his friends, all veterans from different eras, and they shook my hand with a kind of respect I'd never experienced from anyone in my family. We sat and talked for hours. He asked about the deployment, about what I'd learned, about whether I planned to re-enlist. I told him everything I could without violating operational security. And then I asked him the question I'd been holding on to. Why did you and Dad stop talking? Eugene took a long drink of his beer and sighed. Your father wanted me to tell him he was right. When he took over the business, he wanted to do things his way. Expand too fast, take on debt I didn't think was smart. I told him I thought he was making a mistake. He told me if I didn't support him, I could leave. So I left. That's it? A business disagreement? He shook his head. It wasn't about the business, Kayla. It was about control. Your father needed everyone around him to believe he was the smartest person in the room. When I questioned him, it threatened that. So he cut me out. And your mother went along with it because that's what she does. She goes along with whatever keeps the peace. What about me? Did he ever talk about me? Eugene's face softened. He called me once, about 2 years ago. Said you joined the Navy and he didn't understand why you'd throw your life away. I told him you were braver than he ever was. He hung up on me. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. Do you think he'll ever get it? Eugene reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Some people spend their whole lives defending the choices they made instead of questioning whether those choices were right. Your father is one of those people. He can't celebrate you without admitting he was wrong about you. And he's not built for that kind of honesty. We spent the rest of my leave together. He took me to the VFW hall and introduced me to other veterans. He showed me photographs of his time in Korea, stories he'd never told anyone in the family. He asked about my plans, and I told him I was going to re-enlist. I was going to keep pushing, keep proving myself, not to my father but to myself. And he told me that was the only reason worth doing anything. I didn't visit my parents' house during that leave. I didn't call. I drove past it once, saw my father's truck in the driveway and my mother's Lexus parked on the street, and I kept driving. There was nothing there for me anymore. The people I needed to see, I'd already seen. When I returned to Norfolk, Commander Ortiz called me into her office again. She had news. The SEAL team I'd deployed with had submitted commendations for my work. They'd specifically noted my performance during a high-risk operation where my analysis had identified a threat the team hadn't anticipated, potentially saving multiple lives. The commendation was going into my service record, and it came with a recommendation for advancement. You're up for promotion ahead of schedule, Brennan. If you keep performing at this level, you're going to have opportunities most people don't get until they've been in twice as long. I didn't know what to say. Thank you, ma'am, was all I managed. Don't thank me. You earned it. Just don't let it make you complacent. The higher you go, the more people will be watching to see if you deserve to be there. Over the next 2 years, I deployed twice more. Different regions, different teams, different challenges. I worked operations in Africa supporting counterterrorism efforts. I spent time on a naval vessel in the Pacific analyzing communications intercepts related to regional threats. I completed advanced training in signals intelligence and tactical analysis. Every evaluation I received was excellent. Every commander I worked under noted my reliability, my judgment, my ability to stay calm under pressure. But I also learned the cost of this life. I missed birthdays and holidays. I lost touch with college friends who couldn't relate to what I was doing. I had relationships that never went anywhere because I was always leaving. The work was meaningful, but it was also isolating. There were nights when I lay awake in a bunk on a ship or in a temporary quarters on a base somewhere, wondering if I'd made the right choice. Wondering if proving my father wrong was worth the price of this kind of loneliness. Sierra kept me grounded. She'd taken a different path, working in naval intelligence stateside and eventually becoming an instructor. We stayed in touch through emails and occasional phone calls. She reminded me why I'd started this, what I was building, who I was becoming. And she was the first person I told when I got the news that changed everything. I was 27, 4 years into my service, when I received orders to attend a selection course for a specialized intelligence program that worked directly with naval special warfare. The program was highly competitive, reserved for analysts who had demonstrated exceptional performance in high-pressure environments. If I was selected, I'd be working at the highest levels of operational intelligence, supporting missions that would never be publicly acknowledged, making decisions that could shape outcomes on a strategic level. The selection process was grueling. Weeks of assessments, interviews, scenario-based evaluations, psychological testing. They wanted to know how you thought, how you handled failure, how you processed incomplete information, how you made ethical decisions when there were no clear right answers. Out of 40 candidates, they selected 8. I was one of them. The program itself was a year of intensive training. We learned advanced analytical techniques, studied geopolitical dynamics, worked with cutting-edge technology that I still can't describe in detail. We trained alongside special operations personnel, learning to think the way they thought, to anticipate their needs, to provide the kind of support that made dangerous missions possible. And we were taught that our work would never be celebrated publicly, that recognition would come quietly if it came at all, and that the measure of success was whether the people we supported came home alive. I thrived in that environment. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued the same things I did. Excellence over appearance. Substance over style. Results over recognition. Nobody cared that I came from a small town in Pennsylvania or that my family didn't understand what I did. They cared whether I could do the job. When I completed the program, I received my first assignment. I'd be joining an operational task force working on complex, long-term intelligence operations tied to emerging threats. The work was classified at levels I'd never accessed before. The team I'd be working with included some of the most experienced and capable people in naval special warfare. And my commanding officer would be a senior officer who had a reputation for demanding perfection and rewarding those who delivered it. I called my grandfather to tell him. He was in the hospital by then, his health declining. But his mind was still sharp, and his pride was unmistakable. "You've done something remarkable, Kayla. You've built a life on your own terms. That takes courage most people don't have. I learned it from you," I told him. He laughed, a weak sound but genuine. "No, you didn't. You learned it from yourself. I just reminded you it was possible." He passed away 3 weeks later. Heart failure, quick and relatively painless according to the doctors. I flew home for the funeral. It was small, held at the VFW hall with about 20 veterans in attendance. My father didn't come. My mother sent flowers with a card that said our condolences. Trevor didn't acknowledge it at all. I stood at the front of that room in my dress uniform and delivered the eulogy. I talked about Eugene's service in Korea, about the letters he'd written to me during my deployment, about the kind of man he'd been when nobody was watching. The veterans nodded, a few wiped their eyes, and when it was over, they lined up to shake my hand and tell me he'd been proud of me. One of them, an older man named Carl who'd served with Eugene, pulled me aside. "Your grandfather talked about you all the time. Showed us your letters. Told everyone you were going to do big things." He was right. "I wish my father could have seen that," I said quietly. Carl shook his head. "Some men can't see past their own reflection, kid. Don't waste your time waiting for him to notice you. You've already become someone worth noticing." I buried my grandfather with full military honors. A color guard. A flag folded and presented to me as his next of kin. Taps played on a trumpet that echoed across the cemetery. And when it was over, I placed that flag in my car and drove back to Virginia without stopping at my parents' house. The work I did over the next 18 months was the most intense of my career. Operations that required absolute precision. Intelligence assessments that informed decisions at the highest levels of command. Missions where the margin for error was non-existent. I worked 100-hour weeks. I slept in offices. I missed meals and skipped workouts and pushed myself harder than I ever had. But I also became undeniably good at what I did. My analyses were cited in classified briefings. My recommendations were implemented in active operations. And when a particularly complex, high-stakes mission succeeded in large part because of intelligence work I'd led, I received a commendation from a senior officer I'd never met. The commendation came with a note that I'd be considered for early promotion to a rank rarely achieved by someone with my years of service. That's when things started to accelerate in ways I didn't anticipate. I was invited to brief senior leadership on emerging threat patterns. I was asked to contribute to strategic planning discussions. And then, 6 months later, I received a call from Commander Ortiz, who'd been following my career from a distance. "Kayla, you need to prepare yourself. You're being considered for a significant recognition. I can't tell you details yet, but it's going to be public. It's going to be visible. And people are going to notice." "What kind of recognition?" "The kind that comes from the top. Just be ready. And remember, you earned this. Don't let anyone make you feel like you didn't." 3 weeks later, I was sitting in a briefing room when a senior officer walked in and told me I'd been selected to receive the Defense Meritorious Service Medal for exceptional intelligence work that had directly contributed to the success of multiple special operations missions. The award would be presented at a ceremony at Naval Base Coronado in front of an audience that would include senior military leadership, members of the SEAL teams I'd supported, and representatives from the Secretary of the Navy's office. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 months out. Enough time for the news to spread, for media to get involved, for the story to become something bigger than just another military commendation. The notification came through official channels first, a formal letter detailing the award, the ceremony logistics, and the expected attendees. But what I didn't anticipate was how quickly the information would spread beyond military circles. The Defense Department's Public Affairs Office saw an opportunity in the story. A young female intelligence analyst receiving one of the military's highest non-combat honors for work with Navy SEAL teams. It fit a narrative they wanted to tell about capability, about breaking barriers, about the evolving role of women in special operations support. Within a week, I started getting contacted by journalists. First from military publications, then from larger outlets. They wanted to know about my background, my path to service, what the work had entailed. I declined most interview requests, uncomfortable with the attention and unsure how much I was even allowed to discuss. But the public affairs officers encouraged me to do at least 1 or 2, saying it was important for the public to understand the breadth of work happening in the intelligence community. I agreed to a single interview with a reporter from a major news network who specialized in military coverage. We met in a conference room at Norfolk, and she asked thoughtful questions about the nature of intelligence work, about what it meant to support special operations, about the challenges of being a woman in these roles. I answered carefully, keeping details vague, focusing on the broader themes of service and teamwork. I thought that would be the end of it. But the story that aired 3 days later was far more expansive than I'd expected. They'd done additional research, pulled information from public records, contacted people I'd served with who were willing to speak on background. The segment opened with footage of SEAL training, dramatic shots of operations in hostile environments, and then cut to me sitting in that conference room explaining the role of intelligence in keeping operators safe. The anchor's voice narrated over images of military operations. Behind every successful mission is a network of intelligence professionals working in the shadows. One of those professionals is Lieutenant Kayla Brennan, a 29-year-old analyst from Ridgewood, Pennsylvania, who has spent the last 5 years supporting some of the military's most elite units. They showed a photo of me in uniform, professional and composed. Then they cut to an interview with a former SEAL team leader who described my work in vague but complimentary terms. She provided analysis that gave us options we wouldn't have had otherwise. She stayed calm when things went wrong. She earned the trust of every person on that team. The segment continued with details about the upcoming ceremony, noting that over 300 members of Naval Special Warfare would be in attendance to honor my contributions. The anchor closed with a line that would haunt me for weeks. Sometimes the most important battles are won by people whose names we'll never know. Today, we're learning one of those names. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by other outlets. By Saturday, it was trending on social media. And by Sunday, my phone was exploding with calls and messages from numbers I didn't recognize. 17 missed calls from my mother. 12 from my father. 8 from Trevor. Text messages from extended family members I hadn't spoken to in years. Emails from former high school classmates. Even a message from Coach Donnelly, my father's old football coach, saying how proud Ridgewood was of me. I sat in my apartment staring at the screen, feeling a strange mix of vindication and disgust. These were the same people who hadn't shown up when I left for basic training. The same people who'd dismissed my choice to serve as a waste of potential. The same father who'd called me his biggest disappointment. And now, because a news segment had framed my work as noteworthy, they suddenly wanted to be part of the story. Sierra called that evening. Have you seen what's happening online? I've seen enough. People are sharing that segment everywhere. There are articles being written about you. Someone even created a discussion thread analyzing your career path. That's horrifying. She laughed. It's what happens when you do something most people can't comprehend. They turn you into a symbol. Just don't let it get to your head or let it mess with your focus. What do I do about my family? There was a pause. What do you want to do? I don't know. Part of me wants to ignore them. Part of me wants to call them out for only caring now that it's public. You could do both. Ignore them for now, and if they keep pushing, tell them exactly how you feel. I took her advice. I didn't return the calls. I didn't respond to the messages. I silenced notifications from numbers I didn't have saved and focused on preparing for the ceremony. There were rehearsals to attend, protocols to learn, people to meet. The award itself was important, but the ceremony had taken on a significance beyond the medal. It was being positioned as a celebration of the intelligence community's contributions to special operations, and I was the face of it whether I wanted to be or not. 2 weeks before the ceremony, my mother showed up at my apartment in Norfolk. I have no idea how she got my address. I'd never given it to her. But there she was, standing outside my door on a Tuesday afternoon, dressed in business casual attire and holding a Starbucks cup like she'd just come from a meeting. Kayla, sweetheart. I've been trying to reach you. I stood in the doorway, not inviting her in. I've been busy. I can imagine. We saw the news story. Your father and I are so proud of you. The words felt hollow, rehearsed. Are you? Of course we are. This is incredible, what you've accomplished. We had no idea. You had no idea because you never asked. She flinched slightly but recovered quickly. I know we haven't always understood your choices, but we're your family. We want to support you. Where was that support when I left for basic training? Where was it when I deployed? Her expression tightened. We didn't know how to process it, Kayla. You have to understand, this wasn't the life we envisioned for you. No, it was the life you decided wasn't worth your time. And now that strangers are paying attention, you want to be part of it. That's not fair. Isn't it? You couldn't even bother to say goodbye when I shipped out. Dad told me I was his biggest disappointment. Trevor laughed at me. And you stood there and said nothing. Diane's composure cracked, her eyes welling up. We made mistakes. I made mistakes. But we're trying now. Doesn't that count for something? I don't know, Mom. Does it? She reached out as if to touch my arm, then thought better of it. The ceremony. Can we come? Your father wants to be there. Trevor wants to be there. We want to see you receive this honor. It's a military ceremony, not a family reunion. And honestly, I don't know if I want you there. Kayla, please. I'll think about it. That's all I can promise. She nodded, wiping at her eyes carefully so as not to smudge her makeup. Okay. Just please think about it. We love you. I watched her walk back to her car, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a vast empty space where familial obligation used to be. I closed the door and sat on my couch, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed. Another call from my father. I let it go to voicemail. The message he left was stiff and awkward, his voice uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. Kayla, it's your dad. Your mother told me she stopped by. Look, I know I haven't been great about staying in touch. But I saw the news, and I want you to know I'm proud of what you've done. I'd like to come to the ceremony if that's all right. Give me a call when you get a chance. I deleted the message without listening to it a second time. Trevor sent a text that night. "Hey sis, congrats on the award. Seriously impressive. I know I've been a jerk. I'd really like to make it out to California for the ceremony. Can you get me details?" I responded with a single line. "It's a public event. You can find the information online." The requests kept coming. Extended family members reaching out through social media. Old teachers from Ridgewood High sending messages of congratulations. Even people I barely remembered from college were suddenly interested in my life. Everyone wanted proximity to the story, to be able to say they knew me, that they'd always believed in me. But the one message that actually mattered came from an email address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, "From a proud Marine." I almost deleted it assuming it was spam, but something made me open it. "Lieutenant Brennan, you don't know me, but I served with your grandfather Eugene in Korea. My name is Robert Chin. Gene and I stayed in touch over the years, and he often spoke about you with great pride, especially after you enlisted. He passed before he could see this moment, but I want you to know he would have been overjoyed. You honored his legacy in ways he never got to tell you. Congratulations on your achievement. You've earned every bit of it." I read the email 3 times, feeling tears I'd been holding back finally break through. This was the recognition that mattered. Not from people who only cared because cameras were involved, but from someone who understood what service meant, who had known my grandfather, who saw the connection between his path and mine. I wrote back immediately, thanking him and asking if he'd be willing to tell me more about his time with Eugene. We exchanged several emails over the next week, and he shared stories I'd never heard. About Eugene's courage under fire, about his loyalty to his unit, about the way he'd mentored younger Marines even when he didn't have to. Robert told me that Eugene had been one of the best men he'd ever served with, and that the military had lost something when he left. Your grandfather struggled after the war, Robert wrote. He had trouble adjusting to civilian life, to people who didn't understand what he'd seen. The business gave him structure, but it never gave him purpose the way the Corps did. When your father took over and pushed him out, it broke something in him. But when you enlisted, it gave him hope again. He saw you carrying forward something he thought had died with his generation. I printed that email and kept it folded in my uniform pocket. It felt like a tether to something real, something that couldn't be manufactured or performed for an audience. The week before the ceremony, I flew to San Diego and checked into temporary lodging on base. The schedule was packed with briefings, media coordination, and final preparations. I met with the senior officers who would be presenting the award, went through the ceremony choreography, and sat through a public affairs session about how to handle media questions. The attention had grown beyond anything I'd anticipated. Major news networks were sending crews. Military publications were running feature stories. Social media accounts dedicated to military news were posting countdowns to the ceremony. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. 3 days before the ceremony, I received a call from the base commander's office. "Lieutenant Brennan, we need to discuss the guest list. We've received multiple requests from individuals claiming to be family members asking for reserved seating. Can you clarify who should be accommodated?" I hesitated. "What kind of requests?" "Your parents, a brother, several extended family members. They've been quite persistent. We want to honor your wishes, but we need clear guidance. How many seats are allocated for family? We can reserve up to 10 in the family section." I took a breath, thinking about my mother standing at my door, my father's awkward voicemail, Trevor's sudden interest in my career. I thought about the empty chairs at my send-off, the silence during my deployments, the years of indifference. "Put my grandfather's name on one seat," I said. "Eugene Brennan. Honorary placement. He's deceased, correct?" "Yes. But he's the only family that deserves to be there." "Understood. And the others?" "Leave the rest empty. If my parents or brother show up, they can sit in general seating with everyone else. They don't get reserved placement." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you certain? This is your day." If you want them there, we can accommodate. I'm certain. They didn't reserve a seat for me in their lives when it mattered. I'm not reserving seats for them now. Very well. I'll make sure it's noted. After I hung up, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. This ceremony wasn't about giving my family an opportunity to perform pride they didn't feel. It wasn't about letting them claim credit for a journey they'd tried to discourage. It was about honoring the work I'd done, the people I'd served with, and the legacy of a grandfather who'd believed in me when nobody else would. The night before the ceremony, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the temporary quarters staring at the ceiling, running through everything that had led to this moment. The day I'd told my family I was enlisting. The bus ride to basic training with no one to wave goodbye. The deployments where I'd proven myself over and over. The missions where my work had made a difference. The letters from Eugene reminding me I was on the right path. I thought about my father's voice calling me his biggest disappointment, and I realized with startling clarity that his opinion had stopped mattering somewhere along the way. Not because I'd stopped caring about family, but because I'd found something more important. Purpose. Competence. A life built on my own terms. My phone buzzed with a text from Sierra. Tomorrow you're going to stand in front of hundreds of people who respect what you've done. Don't let anyone take that from you. Not your family. Not the media. No one. This is yours. I texted back a simple thank you and finally drifted off to sleep. The morning of the ceremony arrived with California sunshine and crisp ocean air. I put on my dress uniform with meticulous care, checking every detail. The shoes shined to a mirror finish. The ribbons aligned perfectly. The cover positioned at the regulation angle. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I almost didn't recognize. Not because I'd changed physically, but because the person looking back carried herself with a confidence that had been earned through years of proving she belonged. A car arrived to transport me to the ceremony venue. As we drove through the base, I could see people already gathering. Uniformed personnel. Civilians. Media crews setting up cameras. The scale of it was overwhelming, but I focused on breathing steadily and remembering why I was here. When I arrived at the venue, I was escorted to a staging area where other officers were waiting. Commander Ortiz was there, smiling with genuine warmth. She walked over and straightened an already perfect ribbon on my uniform. "How are you holding up?" "Surprisingly calm," I said. "Good. You've earned this moment. Don't let the crowd intimidate you. Just focus on what matters. What if I mess up?" She laughed. "Then you'll be human. But you won't mess up. You never do." The ceremony began with precision that only the military could execute. An honor guard marched in formation, carrying flags that snapped in the coastal breeze. The audience rose as the national anthem played, hundreds of voices joining together. I stood in the wings watching, my heart pounding against my ribcage in a rhythm that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The venue was an outdoor amphitheater on the base, with tiered seating that overlooked a platform decorated with naval insignia and the flags of various special warfare units. The front rows were filled with active duty SEALs in their dress uniforms, a sea of disciplined faces and polished brass. Behind them sat senior officers, military leadership, and invited guests. Camera crews lined the perimeter, their lenses trained on the stage. I scanned the family section and saw exactly what I'd requested. 9 empty seats and one with a small placard bearing my grandfather's name and rank. Then I saw them. My father, mother, and Trevor sitting in the general seating area about 15 rows back. They hadn't listened. Of course they hadn't. They'd come anyway, probably assuming that once they arrived, accommodations would be made. My mother wore a navy dress that looked expensive, her hair styled perfectly. My father had on a suit that didn't quite fit right, his discomfort visible even from this distance. Trevor sat between them in business casual attire, his phone in his hand until my mother swatted it away. I felt a surge of something I couldn't quite name. Not anger exactly, but a fierce protectiveness over this moment. They hadn't earned the right to sit in that front section. They hadn't earned the right to be presented as the supportive family who'd always believed. And I wasn't going to pretend otherwise just to make things comfortable. A senior officer approached and told me it was almost time. I nodded, smoothing down my uniform one final time. The ceremony's master of events, a captain with decades of service, stepped to the podium and began speaking about the nature of intelligence work in modern warfare. He talked about the unseen contributions, the analysts who worked without recognition, the careful balance between risk and reward in every decision made in support of operators in harm's way. Then he shifted to the specific. Today we honor one such professional. Lieutenant Kayla Brennan has demonstrated exceptional capability, judgment, and dedication over 5 years of service. Her analytical work has directly supported multiple high-value operations across 3 continents. She has deployed to active combat zones, worked alongside our most elite units, and consistently provided intelligence that has saved lives and ensured mission success. The audience applauded. I could see heads turning, people trying to catch a glimpse of who was being discussed. The captain continued, detailing the award itself, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and what it represented. He spoke about the rigorous process of selection, the endorsements from multiple commanders, and the recognition from senior leadership at the Department of Defense level. It is my distinct honor to invite Lieutenant Kayla Brennan to the stage. I walked out into the sunlight, my steps measured and deliberate. The applause grew louder. As I approached the platform, I could see faces in the crowd more clearly. SEALs I'd deployed with, their expressions showing genuine respect. Officers I'd briefed, nodding in acknowledgement. And in that moment, I understood something profound. This wasn't about proving anything to my family anymore. This was about being recognized by people who actually understood what the work required. I reached the center of the platform and stood at attention. The senior officer presenting the award, a rear admiral whose career I'd followed with admiration, stepped forward. He read the citation aloud, his voice carrying across the amphitheater with the weight of authority. For exceptionally meritorious service while assigned to Naval Special Warfare Operations from 2019 to 2023. Lieutenant Brennan's intelligence analysis and operational support were instrumental in the planning and execution of multiple classified missions. Her ability to synthesize complex information under extreme time constraints, provide accurate threat assessments, and maintain operational security standards exemplifies the highest traditions of naval service. Her dedication, professionalism, and exceptional performance reflect great credit upon herself and the United States Navy. He pinned the medal to my uniform, the weight of it settling against my chest. Then he stepped back and saluted. I returned the salute, crisp and exact. The audience rose in a standing ovation. The sound washed over me like a wave, powerful and almost overwhelming. I kept my composure, my eyes forward, but inside I was flooding with emotions I'd kept locked away for years. The admiral shook my hand and leaned in slightly. Your grandfather would be proud, Lieutenant. I knew Eugene Brennan. Korea, right? I served with some of the men from his unit years later. They spoke highly of him. I nearly broke then, but managed to hold it together. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. He nodded and stepped aside. The ceremony continued with remarks from other officers, but I barely heard them. I stood there with that medal on my chest and thought about Eugene sitting in his small apartment writing letters to me during my deployment. I thought about the veterans at his funeral who'd told me he was proud. I thought about every moment my family had dismissed my choices, and I realized that their validation had never been necessary. I'd built something real without it. After the formal portion concluded, there was a reception in an adjacent building. I was immediately surrounded by people offering congratulations. Fellow intelligence officers, operators I'd worked with, commanders I'd never met but who knew my work from classified reports. The conversations blurred together, but certain moments stood out. A SEAL team leader I'd deployed with in Africa pulled me aside. I don't say this lightly, but you saved lives on that operation. The intel you provided about that secondary location, we would have walked right into it. You gave us options. You gave us a chance. I was just doing my job. He shook his head. No. You were doing it better than most people ever will. Don't diminish that. Commander Ortiz found me and wrapped me in a quick hug, unprofessional for the setting but genuine. I told you that you were ready. I told you that you'd go far. This is just the beginning, Kayla. A journalist from one of the major networks approached asking for a comment, and I gave a brief statement about being honored to serve and grateful for the opportunity to work with exceptional people. I kept it short and deflected attention back to the teams I'd supported, emphasizing that intelligence work was collaborative and that individual recognition always represented collective effort. Then I saw my family making their way through the crowd toward me. My mother had tears in her eyes, though whether they were genuine or performative I couldn't tell. My father's face was a complicated mix of pride and discomfort, like he wasn't sure what expression was appropriate. Trevor looked impressed in a way I'd never seen before, like he was recalibrating his entire understanding of who I was. Kayla, my mother said, reaching for me. Sweetheart, that was beautiful. We're so incredibly proud. I stepped back slightly, maintaining distance. You came. Of course we came. We wouldn't miss this for anything. My father cleared his throat. You did real good up there, Kayla. Real good. I looked at him directly, studying the face I'd spent my childhood trying to impress. Thank you. Trevor extended his hand. Seriously, sis. This is incredible. I had no idea you were doing this level of work. Most people don't, I said, shaking his hand briefly. It's not the kind of thing that gets advertised. My mother glanced around at the crowd, at the cameras, at the officers in their dress uniforms. This is such an honor for our family. We're just so grateful to be here to share this with you. Something in her phrasing triggered a response I'd been holding back. You're grateful to be here now. Where was this gratitude when I left for basic training? Where was it during my deployments? Her smile faltered. Kayla, let's not do this here. Why not? You wanted to be part of this moment. You wanted to stand here and accept congratulations like you've been supportive all along. But you weren't. You were embarrassed by my choice to serve. You dismissed it as me throwing my life away. My father's jaw tightened. We didn't understand what you were getting into. We were concerned. You were concerned about how it looked. You were concerned about what people would think. You weren't concerned about me. Trevor shifted uncomfortably. Look, maybe we didn't handle things perfectly, but we're here now. Doesn't that count for something? I turned to him. You laughed when I said I was enlisting. You told me women don't do important work in the military. You made jokes about me filing paperwork on a base somewhere. And now you're standing here trying to claim some connection to this because it's suddenly impressive? His face flushed. I was young. I didn't get it. You were old enough to know better. You just didn't care enough to try. A few people nearby had started to notice the tension, conversations quieting as they sensed conflict. Commander Ortiz appeared at my elbow, her presence a steadying force. Lieutenant, there are some people from the SEC Nav's office who'd like a word if you have a moment. I nodded, grateful for the exit. Of course, ma'am. I turned back to my family. I need to go. There are official obligations. My mother reached out again. Can we talk later? Maybe dinner? We're staying in San Diego for a few days. I don't think that's a good idea. Kayla, please, my father said, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Something almost desperate. I know I messed up. I know I said things I shouldn't have. But I'm trying here. You're trying because 300 SEALs showed up to honor me. You're trying because this got on national television. You're trying because it's no longer convenient to ignore me. But where were you when I actually needed you to try? He had no answer for that. None of them did. I looked at each of them in turn, these people I'd spent my whole life trying to earn approval from, and I felt the weight of that need finally lift. I'm glad you came. I'm glad you got to see this. But this moment isn't about you. It's not about our family. It's about the work I've done and the people I've served with. And I need you to understand that your presence here doesn't erase the absence you've shown for the last 5 years. My mother's tears were falling freely now, smudging her carefully applied makeup. We love you, Kayla. I wanted to believe that. Part of me still wanted desperately to believe that. But love without support, love without respect, love that only appeared when it was socially advantageous, that wasn't really love at all. That was something else. Something I didn't need anymore. I have to go, I said quietly. Enjoy the rest of your visit to San Diego. I walked away with Commander Ortiz, leaving them standing there in the crowd. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of handshakes and photographs and conversations that I participated in without fully processing. My mind was elsewhere, cycling through the confrontation with my family, questioning whether I'd been too harsh, wondering if I should have been more gracious. Sierra found me near the end of the event, reading my face immediately. You talked to them. I nodded. How'd it go? About as well as you'd expect. They wanted credit for being here. I wasn't willing to give it to them. Good. You stood your ground. I don't know if it was good. I don't know if it was necessary or if I was just being spiteful. She gripped my shoulder firmly. Listen to me. You don't owe them grace they haven't earned. You don't owe them a reconciliation they haven't worked for. They showed up today because it was convenient, because it made them look good. That's not the same as showing up when it costs something. I know. I just thought maybe I'd feel different once this moment came. I thought maybe their pride, even if it was late, would matter somehow. And does it? I considered the question honestly. No. It doesn't. Not compared to the pride I saw in the faces of the people I've actually served with. Not compared to knowing that my grandfather would have been here if he could have been. Then you have your answer. That evening, I returned to my temporary quarters and sat alone with the medal in my hands. The weight of it was surprising, heavier than I'd expected. I thought about all the operations it represented, all the nights I'd stayed up analyzing data, all the moments where my assessments had carried life or death stakes. I thought about the people I'd worked with who had trusted me with information that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. My phone buzzed with messages. Congratulations from colleagues. Photos from the ceremony that people were sharing. And 3 messages from my family. One from my mother saying they were sorry and asking if we could please talk. One from Trevor saying he understood if I was angry but hoped we could find a way forward. And one from my father that simply read, I was wrong about you. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that. I stared at that last message for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond, wanted to open the door to some kind of reconciliation. But another part of me, the part that had learned to trust my instincts through years of high-stakes analysis, told me to wait. Told me that real change required more than words. That if they genuinely wanted to be part of my life, they needed to prove it through sustained effort, not grand gestures at public ceremonies. I put the phone down and opened my laptop. I drafted an email to Robert Chin, the Marine who'd served with my grandfather. I told him about the ceremony, about the empty seat with Eugene's name, about the moment the Admiral mentioned knowing men from his unit. I told him that I wished my grandfather could have been there, but that in a way, he had been. His legacy, his belief in me, his reminder that service mattered, all of that had been present in every step I'd taken to reach this point. Robert replied within an hour. Your grandfather once told me that the hardest part of service isn't the danger or the sacrifice. It's coming home to people who can't understand what you've experienced. He said the only way to survive that is to find your tribe, the people who get it without explanation. Sounds like you've found yours. That would have made him happier than any medal ever could. I read those words 3 times, feeling their truth settle into my bones. I had found my tribe. The intelligence analysts I'd trained with. The operators I'd deployed alongside. The commanders who'd seen my potential and pushed me to meet it. The veterans like Robert who understood what it meant to serve. These were my people. This was my family in the ways that actually mattered. The weeks following the ceremony brought unexpected developments. The media coverage had been more extensive than anyone anticipated, and suddenly I was receiving invitations to speak at military academies, intelligence conferences, and veteran organizations. The Navy's Public Affairs Office saw value in having me represent the intelligence community, and my chain of command supported it as long as it didn't interfere with operational duties. I accepted select engagements, choosing opportunities that felt meaningful rather than performative. I spoke to students at the Naval Academy about the realities of intelligence work, stripping away the Hollywood glamour and focusing on the discipline and patience it required. I participated in a panel discussion about women in special operations support roles, sharing honest reflections about the challenges and the progress still needed. And I gave a keynote address at a veterans organization event where I talked about my grandfather's influence and the importance of intergenerational military legacy. My family continued reaching out. My mother called weekly, leaving voicemails that grew progressively more emotional. My father sent occasional text messages, awkward attempts at connection that revealed how little he actually knew about my life. Trevor tried a different approach, sending articles about military intelligence work with comments like, "Thought you'd find this interesting," or "Made me think of you." I responded sparingly, polite but distant. I wasn't ready to forgive, and I wasn't interested in pretending that their sudden attention erased years of dismissal. But I also wasn't interested in carrying anger that would only weigh me down. So I acknowledged their messages, thanked them for thinking of me, and kept my boundaries firmly in place. 6 months after the ceremony, I received orders for a new assignment. I'd be joining an advanced intelligence program at a facility I couldn't name, working on projects I couldn't discuss, with the kind of clearance level that meant my work would remain classified long after I left the service. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward, the culmination of years of proving myself capable of handling the most sensitive and consequential intelligence work the Navy conducted. Before I left Norfolk, I drove to Ridgewood one final time. I went to the cemetery where my grandfather was buried and stood at his grave with my dress uniform on, my medals displayed. I told him about the ceremony, about the admiral who'd known men from his unit, about the empty seat with his name. I told him I'd done what he'd encouraged me to do, that I'd built a life on my own terms, and that I finally understood what he'd meant when he said the only approval that mattered was the one you gave yourself. I placed a small flag at his headstone, the kind given to veterans, and I saluted. It felt right. It felt complete. On my way out of town, I drove past my parents' house. The lights were on, my father's truck in the driveway, my mother's Lexus parked on the street as always. I slowed but didn't stop. There was nothing there I needed anymore. No validation to chase, no approval to earn, no relationship to salvage that hadn't been real to begin with. My phone rang as I merged onto the highway. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message later that night from a hotel room 2 states away. "Kayla, it's Mom. I saw you today. I was coming back from showing a property and I saw you at the cemetery. I wanted to stop, wanted to talk to you, but I didn't know if you'd want that. Your father and I have been doing a lot of thinking these past months. We realize we failed you in ways we can't take back. We're not asking for forgiveness. We're just asking for a chance to do better. If you ever want that, we're here. We'll always be here." I saved the message but didn't respond. Maybe someday I would. Maybe someday enough time would pass that I could sit across from them without feeling the weight of every disappointment, every dismissal, every moment they'd made me feel like I wasn't enough. But that day wasn't today. 2 years later, I was promoted again. The ceremony was smaller, held on the base where I was stationed, attended only by colleagues and commanders who'd worked directly with me. No media, no cameras, no public spectacle. Just a recognition among professionals who understood the work and respected the achievement. My family wasn't there, and I didn't invite them. But I did receive a letter from my father that arrived the week before. In it, he wrote about watching my career from a distance, about reading articles when they appeared, about telling people in Ridgewood that his daughter worked in naval intelligence even though he didn't fully understand what that meant. He wrote about the regret he carried, about the things he wished he'd said differently, about the pride he felt that he'd never properly expressed. The letter ended with a single line that I read multiple times. You became someone extraordinary without any help from me, and that's both my greatest shame and my greatest pride. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with my grandfather's letters, the email from Robert Chin, and the citation from my medal. These were the pieces of my story that mattered, the evidence of a journey that had been worth taking. I never became close with my family again. We maintained a cordial distance, occasional phone calls on holidays, brief updates exchanged through messages. They were no longer strangers, but they weren't the people I turned to when things got hard or celebrated with when things went well. That role belonged to the men and women I'd served alongside, the ones who'd earned their place in my life through shared experience and mutual respect. My father's words that day, calling me his biggest disappointment, had once cut deeper than any wound I'd received in service. But standing in formation with 300 Navy SEALs at my promotion ceremony, wearing a medal that represented years of exceptional work, I'd finally understood something crucial. His disappointment had never been about my capabilities or my worth. It had been about his inability to see beyond his own narrow definition of success. And that was his limitation, not mine. I built a career I was proud of, surrounded myself with people who valued what I valued, and created a life that didn't require anyone's permission or approval. That was the real victory. Not the medal, not the recognition, not the moment my family finally noticed. It was the quiet certainty that I'd chosen correctly, that I'd trusted myself when no one else would, and that the person I'd become was someone worth being. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.